Okay, well, thank you all for being here, and thanks for inviting me. I love this conference. I have a tremendous respect for all the science that you all are presenting, and I'm really proud to be up here sharing my own. So let me start with a basic premise, and that is that listening is easy and reading is hard. And by that, I don't mean that listening is simple. I have a toddler at home, and I know that not all humans find listening to be a straightforward task. But I mean that listening people generally become experts at listening without any intervention, whereas reading requires a lot of deliberate practice and a lot of guided instruction over time. Why is that? Well, the simplest model is that there's a common language comprehension core, and we become specialized for listening very early on. And that reading, the main difference in reading is that we are plugging in a new sensory modality into this language comprehension system. And so there's been a lot of ink spilt over the last 20 years about how this visual processing occurs and how it maps into this language comprehension system. And I think that's really important. It's obviously fundamental to the reading process, but there's a lot of evidence that at the comprehension level, there are a lot of people who are fluent readers, they're fluent decoders, but they struggle with reading comprehension. And so there might still be some differences that are worth exploring here. And so a complementary perspective is that reading requires pretty much your entire brain, pretty much every cognitive skill in your arsenal. And that includes word recognition, it includes oral language skills, but it also includes a lot of support skills. Things like attention, planning and organizing, working memory. These are all engaged, they aren't just silent during reading. And to illustrate this, we took activations from neurosynth, reading-related areas, and then the Yo 2011 resting state networks. We combined them, and what you can see illustrated very nicely is that the reading network falls across many different resting state networks, including the frontoparietal, dorsal attention, ventral attention. It's not just sensory processing. There's integration across these intrinsic networks. And so I think there's a real opportunity here to look at reading and listening from the perspective of how information is integrated across these different networks. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the two aims that I'll share with you today are, first, validate that listening and reading are integrative, that this model works with language, and then two, look at modality differences specifically and what systems might be interacting more in reading than in listening. To do this, we have a data set which includes 45 third and fourth graders. Each child did up to 4 runs of a language comprehension task. This task was presented in either the listening modality or the reading modality, and it was, but all the runs followed the same format. And that format was basically they listened or read to a paragraph, then they did a sensory baseline, they listened and read to a second paragraph of that passage, sensory baseline, then there was a resting block at the end. And if you compare the univariate results between the listening evoked regions and the reading evoked regions, you can see that they're pretty similar. It's a lot of middle temporal gyrus, it's the inferior frontal gyrus. This is passage reading, so there's bilateral activity. The main differences primarily fall in visual and oculomotor areas during reading. But we're interested in interactions between systems, so we need to take it to the level of connectivity. And so we extracted time series data from the 264 ROIs used in the Power 2011 paper. We constructed condition-specific connectivity arrays so that we had a passage condition, we had a sensory condition, we had a resting condition, and corresponding connectivity matrices. We thresholded at the top 5% of connections, but the results that I'm showing are robust against changes in thresholds from 2% to 10%. And then we analyzed graph theory and system-specific rewiring measures. So first, how does listening and reading compare with rest? And the two measures we're going to look at initially are modularity, which is connectivity within a network. So if if a visual node only connects to other visual nodes, that results in a highly modular visual system. The other metric is participation coefficient. That's if a visual node connects to attention and auditory and visual nodes. That's a high participation in multiple regions. And what we see is that listening and reading increase connectivity between resting state networks. So at rest, there's a more modular architecture, and then in reading, there's a more integrated architecture. And this is a pretty robust finding. I think you see it in a lot of other tasks. It's not surprising, but it is reassuring to see it validated here. So modularity decreases during listening and reading, and then participation coefficient increases during listening and reading. But what's driving those differences? To do that, we grouped all of the changes in connectivity by resting state network. And each bubble in this figure represents a resting state network. The size of the bubble is related to how many ROIs are in that network. And the edges that connect them are going to represent changes in the number of connections between conditions. We're going to compare comprehension versus rest. So in comprehension, we see increases in the number of connections between almost all the networks. So globally, there's an increase in between network connectivity. Whereas in rest, you see a lot of increases in within network connectivity. And so that's not surprising. We learned about the modular architecture of the brain from resting state data, and we're seeing that replicated here. But it's a nice validation that our measures are both globally sensitive and also showing some region-specific trends. So how do reading and listening differentiate? Well, reading induces a more integrated network structure than listening. So on the level of modularity and participation coefficient, you see decreased modularity in reading, and you see increased participation coefficient in reading. If we just take a global connection level look and just like a quick snapshot of it, what you can see is that the increased connections that we're seeing in listening compared to reading tend to cluster towards the posterior part of the brain, mostly in the visual area, in fact, whereas the reading ones are spread out a little more, don't seem to be as in one network so much. If we summarize that by resting state network, what you see is that in listening, there's greater connectivity within the visual and dorsal attention networks. And one way to think about this is that there's increased connectivity within visual networks. The other way to think about it is there's increased heterogeneity within the visual network during reading. So whereas in listening, your visual network is pretty homogeneous. In reading, it's actually shifting. The network is actually shifting towards one side and becoming less homogeneous globally. The changes in reading are primarily on the ventral attention network. The ventral attention network becomes more connected to the frontoparietal network, the default mode network, somatomotor network, and dorsal attention network. And so I'm generally a little skeptical of these sorts of large-scale connection graphs because they're sometimes sensitive to changes in modularity and things like that. But we have actually another two groups of subjects with this same task design, a younger group and an older group. And the changes in the attention network and the visual network seem to be robust in all three groups. And the other two groups are using different stimuli, so a different set of passages. And so I really think that there's some good evidence here that the attention systems are being differentially engaged in reading compared to listening. And I don't have time to go into detail about it, but the developmental perspective aspect of this is that in these other two groups, we have a younger group and we have an older group, so mature readers and younger readers. And just a quick look at that data shows that throughout development, the modality differences persist, as I just discussed. Attention and sensory areas persist in being different, but there's major differences in both listening and reading, and the distribution of connectivity values in younger readers versus older readers. So younger readers seem to activate the dorsal areas and posterior areas, maybe dorsal attention network, more than older readers who have a more anterior and bilateral connectivity pattern. So we're still in the model building phase of this and what this means for how reading is learned. But the model we're going towards is that these dorsal attention systems, the ventral attention systems, play an important role in, especially early on in readers, in supporting this sensory transformation process, and that our models of reading should incorporate some level of attention into the task. So I'd like to thank my lab and my funding, but I'd also like to send a real shout out to the people who develop the software that we use for these sorts of analyses, because doing this analysis requires going between like 4 or 5 different software packages, and I think the people who develop these things are real saints and enable this sort of research. Thank you.